we're speaking to the very nice venue staff, and they're going to try and warm it up a bit. So hopefully it should be toasty soon. After this session, there's another coffee break. But just before that, Pete's going to come and say a little bit about the unconference. So once the session finishes, if you're interested in hearing more about the unconference, if you can just sit tight for 5 minutes before you go and grab a cup of coffee, that would be great. Otherwise, enjoy this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's chairing the session. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, welcome everyone. Is this sound level okay? Yeah, okay. So this is a panel to talk about open peer review and pros and cons and all sorts of aspects about it. And we have 4 speakers who are each going to talk for a maximum of 5 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to questions and discussion. So we have Xenia van Edig from Copernicus. We have Jigisha Patel from BioMed Central. We have Markie from Faculty of 1000 Research. And we have Micah Allen from University College London, postdoc there. So I'll go straight ahead and ask Xenia to start.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm working for Copernicus Publications. We have been a scientific publishing house since 20 years, and we started open access publishing in 2001. And in 2001, we also started something what we call public peer review or interactive public peer review, since we think that open access has the potential opportunity to also open up the peer review process and make it more transparent. So the interactive public peer review entails a public discussion as part of the peer review process, but the referees can stay anonymous. So it's not really necessarily an open peer review, but it has the advantage that the scientific community and everybody who's interested can follow the peer review process. And so the editor at the very beginning makes a quick access review whether the manuscript is suited to enter the discussion, and afterwards referees need to post their comments in the discussion forum, and they also need to reply there, and also the scientific community is invited to join the discussion for enhancing the manuscript, but the scientific community, they have to disclose their names, anybody who is participating in. And afterward, there's a second stage where the reviewer, where the editor can ask for further revisions, and journals have the possibility to also open up these kinds of reports after the acceptance of the manuscript for final publication. So thus we have quite a lot of experience already with innovative peer review systems for like 13 years now.
Hello, everyone. I work for BioMed Central, which is an open access publisher, and the medical journals on the BMC series operate open peer review. And the way this works is that when a manuscript is submitted, it is peer reviewed in the normal way with 2 or more experts, but the identity of the reviewers is known to the authors, and the identity of the authors is known to the reviewers. And then if the manuscript is accepted for publication, along with the final manuscript, the entire pre-publication history is published as well. So the original submission, the peer reviewers' reports, the revisions, the author's point-by-point response are all up, published there, and available for anybody who's interested to look at. Now, we do this with our BMC series medical journals, which are our in-house journals, and some of the independent journals as well. And you may wonder, well, why only the medical journals? And to answer that question, you have to think back about the history of open peer review. Back in the 1990s, Richard Smith, who was then the editor-in-chief of the BMJ, raised concerns about single blind peer review and wondered whether there were alternatives. And it was the BMJ that did some research on open peer review and found that it was feasible, and also that the quality of the peer review reports were just as good. And the argument that Richard Smith put forward was, given that clinical research informs clinical decision-making, which directly impacts on patient care, these decisions are too important to hide behind anonymity, and they should be open, and the people who make these decisions should be accountable for these decisions. So there was a very compelling ethical argument for open peer review. So to some degree, there was some buy-in from the medical community for open peer review, and BioMed Central was launched in 2000, which was just after the BMJ did all of this work. And so that's why it was the medical journals which took on open peer review. But having said that, these journals have been operating open peer review for over a decade, nearly 13 years. But we don't just publish clinical research. There's a lot of basic research and translational research. So our peer reviewers are not all clinicians, and yet they're buying into open peer review as well. So, I think my question to you is, why are we not conducting open peer review for all science?
Perfect. So if we're just going on today's theme of privacy, I work for F1000 Research, and we're a publishing platform. And basically, we do everything transparently, so that the privacy is completely gone. So what I mean by that is we publish things immediately, so before publication. And once they are published, we then start the post-publication peer review, which isn't to be confused with commenting, which is often called post-publication peer review. But in my eyes, that's kind of post-publication commenting. So once an article is published, we conduct open peer review, which is still formally invited, but these reviews are signed and they're attached to the paper, and they will always be a part of the paper. So that's in PubMed, in Scopus, anywhere you find this paper on the PDF, these papers will have the peer reviews and the comments with them. So what we're trying to do is create a community around the paper. We want the paper not only to be what the authors thought, the paper has also got the buy-in from the reviewers, and together the reviewers and the authors can work to make the paper pass peer review. So what I mean by that is basically to pass peer review, you have to reach a certain criteria, and we have version papers where reviewers and authors work together to reach that stage. So basically, with our transparent peer review, we need accountability from reviewers, and what we do in that sense is add DOIs to every single referee report. And we're working with CASRI and ORCID to make sure that these reviews can sometimes, at the moment, they're not being credited. So together, we're working with ORCID to try and give some credit to reviewers and make sure that these reviews are seen as a part of a scientist's output, because not only do research mean and should tenure go for, it's also, we should be looking at reviews. And so I shall now pass on to my colleague here, who is a researcher.
Thank you. So I'm a neuroscientist and blogger. At my blog, Neuroconscience, I have focused quite a bit both on advocacy for open science and also actually conducting post-publication peer review. And I think I represent, I'm from a field which is probably arguably one of the most conservative when it comes to things like open science and open publishing. And I like to think that in my advocacy work, I represent kind of both looking forward and thinking about what we can do and how we can get to the future we all want to be in, but also trying to hear some of the concerns and see some of the areas where we're still really failing to get that more widespread adoption. One of the things I tend to focus on is the idea that, I should say, I particularly focus on, first of all, the culture surrounding science and publishing. So the idea of what is a paper, what does it mean to do good science, what does it mean to make a publication in this time, and also how do we do that in a very pragmatic sense. So rather than sort of big polemic issues, I like to think very practically, how can we get even the most conservative guys on board? What can we do to hit that critical mass we need to actually see a shift? I think we're in a really exciting time where we both have a huge amount of dissatisfaction in the existing system and a ton of innovation from sort of the people sitting here about how do we actually solve that. But we still have a long way to go somehow in really making the changeover from the established systems to a more radical future. So I like to think I can sort of be a connection between the scientists that are sort of struggling with the realities of an incredibly vicious economic system, and also the idealistic pursuit of actually improving our publication system to be not a relic of a pre-digital era. Is that fair?
Thanks very much. You're all under time, so that's great. Lots of time for discussion. So we can, have we got roving microphones? Who's got those? Maybe somebody can be ready. Where's the, have we got more than one? Maybe somebody else could take the other one so we can find people. If you'd like to ask a question, please could you raise your hand and I'll tell the mic to come to you. For the live stream, we do need everything to come through the microphones. So I don't yet see any hands. Shall I ask maybe an obvious question, which the reason why many people think open peer review is not necessarily a good idea is that junior researchers might find it problematic if they wanted to criticize the paper from a much more senior person, and it might jeopardize their drug prospects. So do any of you have an answer to that criticism? Jigisha.
Yes, I can understand that a junior researcher might be worried about criticizing a senior researcher's work, but open peer review has been working well in the field of medicine. I think this is a problem within the discipline. So I think it is not a reason to criticize open peer review. I think it is a reason to actually turn the tables and criticize the field, where if people are so sensitive that they, senior people are so sensitive that they do not want their research to be criticized, isn't it for them to actually address this problem rather than attack peer review?
Maybe I should ask one researcher we have here to comment on that. How do we go about doing that?
Well, this is one of those things where I always wonder why we can't have it both ways. So I don't see anything in principle wrong with having a peer review system as a place both for open, completely non-anonymous peer review, but also a place, or at least a forum for private commenting, whistleblowing, these types of things. As a junior researcher, I certainly strive to sign my reviews, but I would absolutely, in a very tiny field, feel that I may be at risk when I go for a grant or something if Mr. Big Shot, whose paper I shot down publicly, suddenly gets to rubber stamp, the next 10 years of my life.
Just to comment on the whistleblowing. So peer reviewers do have the opportunity to confidentially raise ethical concerns. So open peer review doesn't prevent that from happening.
So so in that case, so let's say I'm reviewing and I'm like, well, I don't feel comfortable criticizing this person. Does that mean that I back out of the review and you find a person who does feel comfortable criticizing it?
So, I mean, if you don't, so the deal is that it's open peer review. So if you don't feel comfortable putting your name to your review, then you have to decline the invitation to peer review. If you agree and you're peer reviewing and you find, ooh, this article has already been published elsewhere, and you don't actually want to put that in your report, obviously, because it's an open peer review and you're making an accusation of misconduct, you can confidentially raise that. There is a confidential section for you to raise concerns like that, which then the editor of the journal would then take up and follow COPE guidelines to address.
We've got a question from can we give your name first?
Yeah, Theo Bloom from BMJ. It's actually a comment on this point, which is that I think openness is the answer, as well as creating the problem, if you will. Because if you have peer reviewed something courteously and professionally and identified problems with someone's work, and they then stand in the way of your promotion and tenure, everyone can see that that's exactly what happened, and you can point at that stuff. Whereas if it's all done behind closed doors, you can't. So actually openness, provides you with part of the solution.
I think it's unconscious bias as well. If you're already initially thinking that if you're going to review this paper, that it's going to be bad for you, then you should probably decline to review that paper.
I like to add that this, like I said, for our public peer review, it's like that the people can stay anonymous, but since the whole review report is openly accessible in an online forum, and the whole discussion receives the DOI and can decide that people are really quite careful how they say, even if they don't disclose their names at that stage, but only because the whole report is already accessible. Yeah, a lot of these they tend to be really constructive and not like insulting.
Yeah, you check it 3 or 4 times because your name's going to be on it.
Well, except even if it's not, you
Even
still
if
check
it's not,
it. Yeah.
you check it because the wording is in the internet. And no.
Comment up here.
Yeah, it's Damien Pattinson from Plus One. Yeah, I think that's just really important to separate those two things out, whether we're talking about signed review or, to me, open review can just mean that the reviews and the version history are available on the paper, but they don't necessarily have to be signed. In fact, Copernicus is a really good example of how that can work really well. I think I would be surprised if anyone thought that posting reviews on a paper, not necessarily signed, but posting the reviews on a paper is a bad thing, apart from journals, really, who I think stand to be exposed to, some of the reviews that they kind of administer, and it works for them for all that to be behind closed doors. But I'm surprised if any scientists think that's a particularly bad idea. Or I'd like to hear it.
You got any more questions? One at the back.
Peter Rogers from eLife. I've just got a very specific question for Jigisha about the open peer review. If the paper is rejected, is the identity of the referees known to the authors?
Sorry, did you say if the paper is rejected?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It's known to the authors, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm right in thinking it's not published.
It's
so
not
the names-
published, no.
Whereas in Copernicus, if the paper's rejected, the report is still public, but not named.
Yeah, not always. I just checked if like 20% of the reviewers opt to disclose their names during the discussion, and afterward, there's also, if the paper gets finally accepted, they also have a choice that they are named in the acknowledgement section, even if they were anonymous during the peer review. That's also possible. Yeah.
You had a question somewhere? Yeah.
Hi, I guess I've got a question.
Give your name, please.
Sorry, my name's Emma Stoy. I work for Chemistry World magazine. So my question's for Michael, really. You say that everything that you publish kind of gets published straight away without any peer review at all. The peer review takes place after it's been published. What happens, bluntly, if it's complete rubbish? It's already been published, and do you end up retracting things then if it's something that would through a traditional process be rejected by the journal? What happens?
So before anything gets published, we have what we call the in-house hygiene check. So we have internal editors that check it's not a crackpot and it's actual science. But once we look at that and there's a methodology and everything's there, it will be published. And we have had a couple of papers where the methodology was actually wrong, and the reviewers quite rightly gave it a not approved, which is our version of rejected, and they gave a constructive breakdown criticism of why it was wrong. And we had actually a really good example that Micah actually blogged about. We had a paper on brain-to-brain science, and obviously it's a controversial field, but we published it because they pre-registered the study. It was science. It had been done by a lab, but it was fundamentally flawed. And one of Micah's colleagues reviewed it, and because we're an open data journal, we necessitate open data too. He'd actually gone through the data, he'd reanalyzed it and proved it was wrong. So in that sense, in the end, after we'd gone through 2 or 3 versions of there being a conversation between Sam and the author, they got to the stage where the author was like, thank you for pointing out my flaws. I understand this study is flawed, and I'll use your information, and next time I'll base my methods on what you're saying. So it was rejected, but it was rejected in a way where the peers and the author were actually talking, and they come to a decision that yes, you were right.
But does it stay up?
So no, that publication will stay up forever, but it's clearly labelled where it is in the stage of review, but it just won't be sent to PubMed as Scopus, so you won't be able to find it on an index, but within our site you can find it.
Okay, thanks.
More questions, have we? we haven't got one. I wonder if I could ask Peter from Eli just to clarify the process there. I seem to remember there was names but not reports, or am I misremembering that?
Let me take this opportunity just to describe what we think is different about our process. When all the reports are in, the referees are all identified to each other at this stage, not to the authors, but to the other referees. They have a consultation process, and they agree a single decision letter, which is sent back to the authors. If the paper is published and the authors agree, the referee reports and their response to the decision letter and the response to the decision letter from the authors is published. If the referees agree, their names are included in that decision letter. I think over 95% of decision letters are published. I don't have the figures for referees, but it's much, much lower, obviously.
Is everyone too busy looking at Twitter?
I'm Rowena Fletcher-Wood, University of Birmingham. What's the process for nominating the referees? Because there's a whole lot of discussion in the ethics of that.
Maybe Xenia, can you answer that?
Basically, it's like in the traditional peer review too. The editor is sending out editor nomination, then they can accept this nomination or decline. It's like, but the discussion is open until at least two referees submitted their report. So it's that at least the beside the commentary from public that at least two referee reports are in the discussion forum.
Is it different in any of the others, or is it the same editors choose referees?
We ask the authors to, actually, because if anyone's going to know who can review their work properly, it's the author.
Yeah, of course, we allow also for suggestions, but it's still up to the referee who he takes. Yeah.
I have a question which relationship, sorry, Martin Fenner from PLOS, in sort of that it might be more difficult to reject the paper if it's public, so that if you have most of your papers are accepted anyway, then it's nice to have an open discussion. But if you have criteria where are pretty harsh and reject most of the things, then it's much more difficult to do. So I don't know who wants to respond to that aspect.
Yeah, I think that applies to the more selective journals. I suppose, I don't know which of your journals are, do any of your journals reject a lot?
Actually, for us, it's really like that also because the author's manuscript is already public. It has a much higher quality, that's from our experience, compared to those which are with a closed peer review process. So indeed, the rejection rates for the discussion journals tend to be lower, but it's really because there's also during the discussion, the quality of the manuscript is really, the quality assurance, because of the transparency, I have the feeling it works better, and therefore, you also can say vice versa, but I think it's this way why they tend to reject less paper, because there's really this quality assurance process from, okay, if I know my manuscript will be published, it's the same as the review report that really try to be submitted really good levels.
We have the question over here first.
Well, I think if you're going to review for a high impact journal, the likelihood is that you may have to reject. And in that sense, it might be, and for a researcher, I don't know if I would sign my name, because you're probably going to be known as the reject man if you're in a small discipline and you keep rejecting papers. It's not something that you want in a small field.
Yeah, of course might be, but also only to like bring this impact argument into relation. Actually, the journals or some of the journals with interactive discussions are those with the highest impact factor that we publish. So it's nothing to do with lower quality or so. Yeah.
John Butts with UCL. In my field, I've no experience with open peer review apart from the preprint servers and the stuff that goes on there. So in the journal context, I have no experience. One of the ways of knowing who your reviewer is papers. You can usually, and I wondered if citation patterns, if anyone watches citation patterns and develop, and citation clubs, are they affected by this? Is anyone looking at that as you make these changes?
A little more difficult to do in open peer review because your name's next to it. So if you're asking to cite 5 papers, then it's the community can really look at it. But yes, I still see it in open peer review. I mean, it's the citation is the coin of the academic. So if they can get a free one through the review, I do see that happening.
Sorry, Damien Patterson from PLOS again. Actually, John, just in response to that, I spoke to an academic last week who said that they deliberately put other people's citations on in order to throw the authors off the scent. So, and in fact, he even sometimes writes in British English instead of American English in order to, again, do that. So I was just going to say, what is interesting is that the Copernicus and F1000 that both have this kind of open, early posting, they have much higher acceptance rates. And I think it's partly because I think authors get the papers in better nick before they submit it, which I think is great. And secondly, that reviewers are kind of assessing it more on a kind of correctness level, kind of, what I think is the sort of +1 type approach of, is it right, rather than the broader kind of how can we improve it. And I think a really big question, again, I'd be interested to hear people's responses, is whether they see peer review as a way of improving papers, or whether it's just should be just a check for correctness. And a lot of authors say, 85%, I think, in surveys say that authors feel that peer review is there to improve their papers. But to me, that just seems like a massive hold-up, and often the improvements are very minor compared with the time it takes to get there. So I would prefer to see peer review as more of a kind of check for correctness and little more than that. But interested in other
Any comments from our panel on that?
I think there is a difference between medicine and biology here, because I think in medicine there needs to be some kind of stamp of approval and your check for correctness. I'm not talking about interest or impact. I'm just talking about, is this work sound? And I think that's where I differ from my colleagues here, in that I would feel uncomfortable having a clinical research published and then undergo peer review. I think there does need to be a sort of pre-publication check for correctness. And then after publication, fine, more people can comment on it if they want to.
Hi, Jojo Independent, not just me. I don't work for the Independent. I met someone who said that he never rejected a paper. And this made me think, firstly, that's a bit stupid, but then secondly, I thought, well, why not? And you were just saying about how if it's just to improve a paper.
You mean it was a reviewer?
As a reviewer, he never rejected a paper. And I thought, well, I'd like to send you every paper. But then he doesn't really know anything about my field. And I think it might be different, as you say, from field to field. Because I've certainly looked at a few questionable medical papers because they just make medical students write papers desperately, and they're not researchers, not trained as researchers, but they still make them do it. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, with the peer review process for reviewers, for scientists, what is it for, essentially? Do we really need to outline why we're doing this? Is it to improve the science, or is it to get better publications that people, even if it's a bad paper, probably won't cite anyway? If it's a good paper, people will cite it. So as from the publication standpoint, do you want the best papers, and is that why you're doing the review? Or as science in general, do we want the best science?
I think in that regard, I think peer review should help improve papers. I think that's why it is there, really. And I think the reason you're going to get better reports, I think, if they're open and people can get credit for them, because the reviews you were just talking about, I think in an anonymous peer review, you can get away with sending in a "don't publish this paper." Whereas in open peer review, people see who you are, they know where you're from, and you can't really get away with that. For me, yeah, I think it should be a collaborative process. I think everyone should be credited, the authors mainly, because it's their work. But if a new experiment was asked for and it was done and improved the paper, then why not the reviewer get a bit of credit for that too? I think it should be much more collaborative. I think in science at the moment, peer review is seen as like a battleground when it should really be seen as a community.
I think you make a really good comment, and in some ways we might be jumping the gun here talking about open peer review, and perhaps we should be sitting here discussing what is peer review for, because I don't think it's very clearly defined and different people have different views on what peer review is intended to achieve.
Yeah, just to pick up on those points, I think really the underlying issue here we're talking about is exactly what is a publication and what is peer review in this era. And I mean, I think it was a really nice point to divide between sort of more clinical stuff and more theoretical or basic things. I mean, I work in a very basic research field, and I tend to think that the best metaphor for what we're doing or what we want to be doing is something like open source code, where instead of a paper being kind of an artifact that you stamp and it's done and it has a goodness or a badness, you know, it's really rather a research project that's going on over years and it's continuously being versioned and developed, and people are forking it and taking their own way with it. And, you know, in that sense, then peer review is not so much of a quality control per se, but more about added value and about, you know, getting the best value you can out of those different versions. But I can totally see where in something like clinical, you know, you could really have a concern, well, someone's done a bad trial of some, you know, holistic therapy or something, and now it's being pushed for whatever reason, that you could have actual harm being tied to that. So I think we exactly really do need to think about, is peer review about putting rubber stamp, or do we want a science that's more like, you know, open source code that's always living and dynamic? And I think that's a really interesting discussion to be having.
Sorry, thank you very much. Alison McInerney from ICE Publishing and ICE Science. I just wondered, coming back to what you said actually about battlefield, I just wondered at what point do you ever have to rein in things, such as when things start to become either a little bit personal or they're not so much helpful towards the manuscript progression, when you can tell that there's maybe some sort of biasness between maybe lab groups and things like that, and if things are becoming a little bit more kind of attacking towards a paper, when do you step in and say, actually, you're right to have your opinion and you're right that this is your opinion on the scientific matter, but actually things are starting to get a little bit out of the wayward for that? How do you can help control that?
It's a good question. I always come to this one example when answering this question. We had a reviewer who had done a report, a good report. It was constructive, but the language used was a bit heavy-handed, let's put it that way. And just before the paper went up, the review went up, sorry, she realized that it was going to be open peer review. And so, halt the process. I need to change my report. So it came back, same content, same quality, but the verbs used were completely different. It went from, I cannot believe that they have, to maybe the author should probably think about. And, you know, I think open peer review helps bring in, you know, this more positive community vibe, rather than, you know, anonymity can allow you to be a bit more snarky.
Just also a quick example. What we do is that we also, if the editor comes and say, hey, this comment from a member of the scientific community or also from a reviewer is really not helping at all and really tend to be insulting, also we say, okay, then we have the right to remove the comment from the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Angela. I'm just finishing off a postgraduate program in clinical neuroscience. I'm going to say something, I don't know what you're going to think about this, and I might get shot down. So, but I was thinking, as students, when we get our work marked, typically 2 people mark our work. Okay, usually you have like a first marker and a second marker or a double marker. If you do peer reviewing, I know there's kind of logistics about getting people together, etc., and you're going to make it open. Why don't you just have 2 people? Obviously, 2 people may get shot, but there'll be kind of like a team together, and have 2 people doing an open reviewing rather than 1 person. I do understand you're going to come back to me about the logistics, but I'm just wondering what you think about the more about that idea.
No, excellent point. At F1000 Research, we have co-refereeing, kind of also for the students, because they get asked to do reviews too. And if they are afraid of, annoying a top researcher, we have the ability for 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, as many people as they want to review a paper together and sign together. But just to have their PhD supervisor with them together, it gives that review a lot more clarity.
Can I just clarify the question? Because I think most journals already have at least more than 1 reviewer for every paper. Oh, can you use the microphone? Yes.
So if it's open review, both of them, so usually when it's more than 1 reviewer, you'll have like maybe somebody from Edinburgh, maybe from Scotland, maybe from Oxford. I'm kind of like talking about 2 reviewers, maybe from different universities or from academic fields, but together kind of like signing on off it together. So doing it as a team, 2 people as a team, than just 1 person.
Interesting idea. I don't know if any journals do that at the moment.
Yeah, we do.
Yes, down here. Or someone's already got the micro, sorry.
That's all right. Hi, I'm Ginny. I'm from Things We Don't Know. We write about the unanswered questions in science, but for a general audience. So I was wondering how you see your relationship with journalists and science journalists. At what point can a journalist come to a paper that's on your website and report on that? Because if it's always going through the peer review process, at what point is it okay for us to then tell the public about it?
It's like normally we say, okay, because after the final acceptance, we normally do also press releases and so on. But there are exceptions because, for example, so Copernicus mainly publishes in geosciences. So we, like 2 weeks ago, the new global carbon budget was published as a discussion paper first. And then we already had to press release for the discussion paper because it's so, it's really one of the basics of the IPCC report and so on. So it's really something.
Because that's one of the big problems, I would have thought, is that journalists like to get the scoop. They like to get something as soon as it's come out. And if it's coming out before it's been peer reviewed, is there not a danger that more unscrupulous journalists might jump on it before anyone's really been able to say whether it's good science or not? And how do you prevent that?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, especially at F1000 Research, when papers are public without peer review, that can be a problem. We have gone out of our way to make it sure in the title we clearly labeled not peer reviewed, but I mean, people are not going to see that necessarily. So that is a problem. For journalists who want to report on our work, we've got a track button, which if you click, you get alerts every time a peer review appears on that. So you should know exactly when you can do it, but I do see your point.
From Point of Science. Question, it seems to me a bit outdated to have only 2 or 3 reviewers. Maybe if I think about Amazon reviews, they won't have only 2 reviewers and then others just leaving comments. Now, the question is, if we can have a continuous reviewing process, for example, X publishes a paper and then it gets reviewed and reviewed again, and the more reviews you get, the more verified is your paper or non-verified. Depends on the reviews themselves. And I just wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think F1000 allows comments as well, doesn't it, after the reviews? And maybe
It does, but I mean, everyone knows no one really leaves comments in the science publishing world.
I think that that's where improved modularity comes from. So I know there'll be mixed opinions, but I think early models like PubPeer and stuff add a kind of transparent layer to the web that anybody can use to review. Some of it has been controversial, and certainly you can get the best and worst of peer review in that format. But I think, I tend to be more radical in terms of modularizing all the different steps of science and having them be more independent from central publishers. And then you can have continuous review and even things like continuous metadata review, right? So we have very little metadata about the science that gets published right now, but you could easily imagine, rich tags, the kind of stuff that peer review we submit to journals, we usually submit these quantitative rankings of what we think the impact is, what we think the quality of the methods is. But you could imagine easily being able to filter science by the aggregation of all those reviews, and it doesn't have to be done by a centralized publisher, I don't think.
I just want to touch back on the, I'm sorry, I'm Lori Goodman from the journal Gigascience. I wanted to touch back on the concerns about the press reporting on scientific articles before they've been peer reviewed. And obviously with Faculty of 1,000, because these are coming out ahead of time, prior to their peer review, this makes them potentially one of the areas you would do that. I'm not sure why we think we have to protect people from reporters talking about papers that are done by reputable scientists just because they haven't yet been tested slightly or deeply by peer reviewers. Because right now, all you see on the internet then is why ionic scarves cure, arthritis. I think we should be promoting people talking about reputable scientists' work even prior to peer review. I'm not quite sure why there's this protection other than to give people time, a lot of press to give people time to come up with a more detailed story. But other than that, I think this should be talked about all the time in process.
People already talk about conference presentations after all, so yeah.
This is actually back to Theo Bloom from the BMJ, back to the point about commenting. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is the BMJ gets tens of thousands of comments on its articles, hundreds every month. And I was tempted to think that's because of the difference between like practicing physicians versus researchers. But actually it's not the case that everyone who's commenting is practicing physicians. I happened to be on duty monitoring these things when the Ebola was first starting to be diagnosed in Europe and the US, and people were very concerned. You have sort of, professors of epidemiology writing very thoughtful responses that you might think of as a blog post somewhere as a response to an article, and that's a place where they do it. I'd be really interested to know if anyone done any research on, who comments where and why, because we're a bit used to saying nobody comments on articles, and actually they do in some settings, and I just don't know why they do in some and not in others.
I'd like to know how much if people can find these comments. I mean, I really think that would be great to see all of these comments, but do they get hidden?
So they're linked per article, but they can also be cited uniquely.
Just a short comment. I would say that in my field of cognitive neuroscience, bloggers, people like Neuroconscience and Dorothy Bishop, have completely changed the way we read our research and are having a huge impact, both in terms of people like Dorothy Bishop and Uta Frith, who will go and comment on a sensational or overhyped article about something like autism, and various other places where there sort of feels like there's a new level of peer review there, which is completely independent from any publisher, and I think adds a lot of value. I know even very conservative, sort of anti-open science groups who still read everything the everything the neuroskeptic publishes, right? Because he provides a nice service, kind of grilling through papers. It's somewhere in between, entertaining to read and also informative. I think that's a rapidly evolving area.
I mean, one point is that they have to be linked somehow back to the paper, and I think various metrics organizations are attempting that. It's not easy.
So PubPeer, and I think PubMed Comments, I'm not sure. I know PubPeer has recently released a feature where you can actually embed blog posts and things as peer comments. I think it still has a long way to go. But you could imagine like a centralized Reddit or something that would somehow be aggregating all of this information.
No, I wanted to add for us, where we use invite the scientific communities to more or less the public to comment during the peer review process. It really depends much on the topic of the paper, whether there are comments or not from like beside the reviewer comments. There are topics which are so heavily discussed in atmospheric sciences, for example, and then others it's really that you think, yeah, okay, and nobody's really caring about it. And I'm always wondering, yeah, but it's like this.
one right at the back. Forwards.
Hi, my name is Katie Alexander, Frontiers. I just had a question. So the panel's touched on collaborative review, and a lot of the comments that we're hearing now around open peer review or other, it all seems that collaboration is really at the heart of it. So what does the panel think? Do you think that's where we should be moving towards, whether it's open or not? It's more about the collaboration.
I mean, I think from the author's perspective, collaborative peer review would be very useful, because often an author will get a positive review and a negative review, and will be asked, the review will actually be raising exactly the same points, but in a positive and negative way, and it's unclear how they should respond. And collaboration amongst the peer reviewers would simplify that for them. So I don't think that in itself really, it doesn't matter whether peer reviewers collaborate or not, and whether it's open or not. I think they're both very good things to do.
Cameron Nayland Plus. Too many things to respond to, but I wanted to start from the notion that it's really interesting. Someone said this morning, mentioned the RIN report from 2010 saying how, oh, everything was going to change in 5 years, and yet it hasn't. And yet actually in 5 to 7 years from the first science blogging conference, we have a panel with, a whole series of publishers and journals actually doing this, which is, and much of this was already happening, but the notion that that's happened. And yet at the same, so the world has changed. Yet at the same time, this question of linking back the comments. I remember at that very first meeting, Maxine Clark stood up and said, why can't we gather all the comments from all the blogs and pull them back to the papers? And yet we've still not managed to do that. But I wanted to pose a kind of slightly negative question, which was, we've got 2 publishers who post content before it's reviewed, after some form of review, and one that's posting things with people's names on it. And I'm wondering, in a world where we had Italian seismologists just get off a criminal charge last week, have you had any experience of actual legal challenges and people threatening to sue, or things going wrong because things were made public? Or are there risks, or have you seen examples where people perhaps are seeing legal liability because their names are on things? Is that a risk we need to deal with, and how might we do that?
So, I mean, we have had problems which is specific to the openness, and they relate mostly to people flagging competing interests because they know who the peer reviewers are, and they will let us know, oh, this person should never have peer reviewed. I don't think it's a problem. As I said, I think this problem is common to all publishers. It's run of the mill, and we deal with them on a case-by-case basis. The openness is just an extra tier of complication that we have to deal with, but we can deal with it. I think, in my experience, there's only ever been one case where we were worried about the content of a peer review report, and we were worried it might be libelous. And we went as far as consulting, lawyers about whether we should or shouldn't publish it. And in the end, we decided we should, because there wasn't really we decided in favor of openness, and we published it and risked it. And it was fine. And in fact, the person who wrote it wasn't worried. It was less worried than we were. So we went to the reviewer and said, do you realize, you've written this and it could be libelous? And he said, oh, no, nonsense. It's absolutely fine. And it was absolutely fine. So we were probably a bit too overcautious. So in answer to your question, yes, there are problems that are specific to open peer review, but I think they're not huge problems, and they can be overcome.
Hi, Denise Bilotta, independent, same independent organization, which is just myself. I have a question for you all. The whole, and I would like to have your opinion, the whole point of the peer reviewing process, as far as I can see, is to validate the paper, the experiments, the results. Okay, we disagree on that already. My point is, by doing so, the peer reviewer basically evaluate how solid is the results, the conclusions, the methods. But that we have many cases in science where it turns out that a very important discovery turns out to be completely made up from fake results. So like no scientific discovery has been behind their paper is retreated and scientists are generally fired from their position. Do you consider maybe asking to the scientists to open their data, like the raw data from their experiments, that will allow other scientists in the scientific community to evaluate more deeply whether the results are actually worthless or not? Thank you.
Yeah, so F1000 research, we won't publish anything without data. So every figure and graph has to have the raw data behind it. So the reviewer can make a more concerted look at the paper, look at the data, how they've analyzed it, and the public can also use it maybe for their own studies, but can also look at it. But yeah, I think open data is key, and it goes hand in hand with peer review.
Yeah, I definitely agree. For our journals, we have a data policy which is asking, it's not mandatory yet, but what we have is the data journal, so that people can describe their data sets, deposit their data sets on a suitable data repository, and the descriptive articles then also can be cited. And this journal also has such public peer review, so that also the review on the data sets can be accessed. So, and sometimes we have like interjournal special issues between research journals and this data journal, where you then have both the research article and a data article and the underlying data set. And this is like the ideal case. And we also have such thing for model. So we have a journal which is really for the description of geoscientific models. So where all the model code can be deposited and described, and yeah, so as parts for the reproducibility. So it's not mandatory for all journals, but a lot of journals are applying this, or a lot of authors, and yeah, especially with the data journal in intersection of.
Alexis Webb, UCL. I have a question for Michael regarding the open data. What support or what structure does F1000 have in place to actually allow researchers to upload their data? We've had issues in the past with papers that we've published elsewhere that we, have to send them 3 terabyte hard drives because there isn't infrastructure for us to actually have our data be online in these journals. So just curious.
So we work closely with Figshare. They were our first kind of guys that we worked with, and we kind of started at the same time, and we kind of worked together on what data files might be needed and how we should work together. We also work with Dryad, who are also very good. But we're also now trying to do some data hosting ourselves because cost less. But yeah, it's a big part of what we do, and that's what we are concentrating on at the moment, making sure that we can at least look after all this data. We're also even doing data manipulation within articles. We're really playing with it, so the data is also an integral part of what could be seen as a static paper, but we think papers should be a bit more dynamic with the technology that we have these days.
Open data is a very interesting big issue. We should probably have the last 5 minutes just thinking about open peer review. Have we got more questions on that? Thanks anyway.
Well, I have actually, Martin Fenner from PLOS, a question for eLife, if they don't mind, because a little bit earlier we had the discussion about collaboration on reviewers, and I know that that's very important to the eLife model, so that reviewers talk to each other before they make a final decision, but I don't know enough of the details.
Yeah. Do you have a specific query about it, or do you just want a little bit more explanation of how it works?
Well, maybe if you can just give a brief comment on that's really helpful, or is that just something you do, or reviewers like that? It improves the coordination between the different reviewers, things like that.
eLife tried to do lots of novel things when we were launched, and we're still trying to do them, but the peer review process is the one thing that seemed to have been the most popular among authors. And we think there's 2 aspects of it that appeal. One is that rather than have 3 reports to deal with, which may be contradictory to some extent, they just get 1 report, which is what they have to do to get published. And that really seems to be the things that people welcome. They don't have to argue their way out of lots of points or do a massive rebuttal. They get a very focused letter that explains what they need to do. The other thing we think that the consultation process does is it actually encourages civility among reviewers. So it's been mentioned earlier on, sometimes reviewers are incredibly rude and use intemperate language, or they put in sort of reports which aren't terribly useful but could derail a paper. If you have a peer review consultation where all the referees know who all the other referees are and what they've said, and they have to be able to stand behind their reports. So if someone says, this paper is rubbish and it shouldn't be published, and someone else thinks it's a good paper, they can challenge each other to find out, is it a good paper? And that's a very stark example, but that's the sort of issues it basically encourages good behavior and civility among reviewers.
Do they do this on a forum where everyone can see everything, or is it kind of like an email exchange? How?
It's on our editorial system. So as soon as the last report is received, all the reviewers then get an email saying all the reports are in this paper, but value your views on the other paper. So then someone goes, I agree with points 1, 2, and 3.
So a bit like Frontiers, they do that very successfully.
I've never used the Frontier system, but I think it's fairly similar in spirit, yeah.
So it seems like that gives some of the advantages of open peer review without necessarily having to have the names completely public.
Yeah, it's a step towards open peer review. It's open within the group. But as I say, they don't have to reveal their identity when the paper is published if it's accepted. But some of them do, but I think the majority don't.
Any final thoughts? We've got a few more minutes.
I just wanted to raise one thing that I don't think we discussed, which is probably the most common thing I hear from my colleagues, and that's concerns about labor and reward. So I know that a lot of my colleagues, for example, are no longer peer reviewing for journals like Frontiers because there's a sensation or a feeling like it's an endless review and you never get out of it. At some point, you just have to back out and then it goes to someone else if you want the paper to be rejected. And obviously that's not applicable to every open science model, but I think I hear a lot this concern of how long is it going to take? What's the incentive for me to do it? I guess there's a feeling that in classic peer review, unfortunately, people spend something probably like 15 minutes, which isn't good. But I think that's actually, I think if you could get a true measure, you'd find that most people kind of wait to the last minute and do like an hour max. So what I want to say is I think if you look at models like F1000 and the PeerJ, something really nice about that is because you get the DOIs on the reviews themselves, you have a little built-in incentive to actually spend that time and make it really nice, because it almost becomes a mini paper in itself, like the review of the telepathy paper, which in the end became a more useful piece of information than the paper itself.
Yeah, I mean, credit's always a hard thing to do. I mean, we can't pay all of our reviewers, obviously, but DOIs, I don't know, as a researcher, do you think that's enough? Is there anything else that researchers can have? I think this is a question that all publishers would like to know. Is there?
I mean, I think, like you said, the coin of the academic is the citation, for better or for worse. So it's probably a good start. And I think having as clear as possible, like even with that, there was a point when Sam had to kind of back out because they were going on, and it was like, I mean, you can't spend a month on a review, right? Unless there's, we're rather time pressed, I think.
Talking of which, just to mention, there's a company called Publons that has some kind of way of crediting reviewers wherever they've reviewed, including if they've done it anonymously. So that's maybe worth thinking about to solve that one. There may be other similar systems out there. I think we may have to draw that to a close. Thank you very much indeed. I realised I didn't actually introduce myself properly. My name's Anna Sharman. And my company is called CoFactor. We've actually got a journal selector tool which will help you look for open peer review journals if that's of interest to people, and other things. So, sorry, it is now the coffee break. That's what I did say, and I think it's half an hour and then it's back in here for the next one. Is that right? Anything else I need to say now? No? Thank you very much.
Yes.
So